Society initiative. This talk is also sponsored by the Indigenous Speaker Series organized by the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and we're also grateful for the support of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. So now to our speaker. Kim TallBear is an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota. She has a PhD in the history of consciousness from UC Santa Cruz, and in 2013 published the acclaimed book Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science with the University of Minnesota Press. The book studies the ways genetic science is co-constituted with notions of race and indigeneity. TallBear's broader interests are in the historical and ongoing roles of technoscience in the colonization of indigenous peoples and others. Because tribes and other indigenous peoples insist on their status as sovereigns, she's also interested in increasing the role of technoscience in indigenous governance. Dr. TallBear is active in the professional circles of Native American studies and science and technology studies, and her work also extends outside of academia to collaboration with Native writers and newer work in creative prose writing, and I gather we may hear some of her storytelling today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim TallBear, who will be speaking on molecular death, desire and Redface Reincarnation, Indigenous Appropriateness in the U.S. and Canada.
So I have no mic, but this is good, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That didn't even occur to me. I like mics. I didn't do, I kind of got lazy and I didn't do a land acknowledgement. Does anybody local want to do a welcome to territory for me so I don't put that? No. Do you ever do that around here? Did anybody do it off the top of their head? I know I should have asked earlier. If you're not comfortable, it's okay, but that would make me feel like less. I can't think of a word. No? Okay. I will remember to get on that next time. So this is kind of a long talk. I normally try to cut my talks at 45 minutes because I mostly give lectures these days that have a large element of the public in it, but I assume this is a pretty academic audience. And this piece is actually kind of a combination of something that's coming out in a book called Indigenous Foucault, but I tried to go easy on the Foucault because I don't even like doing it, but it's there, you know it, you'll see it. And it's got some stuff in it from another article that's coming out in, how do you say, CalFu, this American Studies journal, and the whole issue was edited by George Lipsitz, and it's on Amy Morton Robinson's book, The White Possessive. So it's kind of a mashup of a couple of things, and then both of those articles were drafted and submitted a year ago, and then all this Elizabeth Warren stuff happened, and I've been drugged back into this conversation. So I think it's pretty coherent anyway. It's a bit long, so I apologize for that, but hopefully it's entertaining. And I do have a big Foucault piece I can cut out. If I look out towards the end and I see you're getting weary, I'm going to skip over that. It's highlighted in yellow, so let's do that. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you a video. Now this video is from Maury Povich. However, whether she's like exaggerating or not, I've actually seen this reaction in real life, which is why I'm using it. I don't normally have Maury Povich videos in my talk, but this is akin to what I run across in real life.
I've always wanted to find out exactly what I am because nobody believes me when I tell them I'm 25% Native American. I actually was named after my great-grandmother who's full-blood Cherokee, and nobody believes it. Red hair, pale skin, they think I came straight from Ireland.
What will the DNA truth reveal about Mary's heritage?
Honestly, I don't know what I'm going to tell my family. Everyone ever always thought my grandfather was full-blood Native American, and it's only saying 5%. It should say 25 on here. But 15% sub-Saharan African. My mom always thought she was a half Native American, or stood by it, and she's no longer with us, so I guess I'm glad that she didn't have to know this because she was so proud.
So that encapsulates how black people and red people are racialized differently to shore up white supremacy, right? We'll get a lot of that. Which is so perfect. So this is going to make some of you uncomfortable probably, I don't know. On the prairies of Canada, we're not treating this problem with kid gloves anymore, so we're being very direct. Which is good, because that's more in line with how I feel. So I'm going to give you 2 cases of playing Indian. I don't have the Elizabeth Warren stuff kind of incorporated into this talk very much yet. Would have made it, but if you follow me on Twitter, you know that that's a lot of what I've been having to deal with in the past few months, and I'll talk about the similarities where I can bring them in. So in 2015, 14 Indigenous US-based feminists, including me, wrote and signed a letter published in Indian Country Today that explained that Andrea Smith of the University of California, Riverside had long been accused of falsely claiming Cherokee identity. Inside Higher Ed then picked up the story. Smith was prominently known as an Indigenous feminist scholar and anti-violence activist. It was not an easy decision to make to publish that letter calling her to account for her claims. Speaking only for myself, I was disheartened and frustrated at having to publicly raise the issue. I had been a friendly acquaintance of Smith's in graduate school at UC Santa Cruz back in 2001-02. Having grown up in both reservation-based and urban Native American communities prior to my PhD, I worked as an environmental policy specialist for federal agencies and with tribes and communities across Indian country. So with that background, both personal and professional, it was clear to me right away that Andrea Smith was not connected with the Cherokee Nation that she claimed. I've got relations there, both professional and personal. But I, at the time, and still am, averse to policing the nature of people's lived connections to Indigenous communities, so I didn't say anything. I'm also accustomed, as are many of us who venture out of Indigenous community into the wider US American landscape, to encountering people who make much of their Indigenous ancestry despite having no lived experience in our communities. Years later, in 2011, I heard from respected Indigenous studies colleagues about shifting ancestry claims and unsubstantiated stories that had come from Andrea over the course of a couple of decades. In fact, Cherokee Nation genealogy experts traced her ancestry to non-Indigenous people alone, and Cherokee genealogists tell me that they do far more non-Cherokee genealogies than they do actual Cherokee genealogies, because that's the number of fake claimants versus actual claimants. So they don't actually really end up doing as much Cherokee genealogy as they would like. And when somebody well-known is claiming to be Cherokee, they do their genealogy. So be careful if you're going to get famous and do that. They will do your genealogy. So Smith had been confronted in person and privately by colleagues, friends, and Cherokee Nation officials, but persisted in claiming a Cherokee identity for decades. Now, I had only suspected her of being unconnected, not of construing a Cherokee lineage, despite the presence of considerable evidence to the contrary. It was 4 years after I heard that whole account before Smith's story came into public light. And the reason that many of us in Indigenous studies declined to address this case was not only that it was personally uncomfortable or painful for some of the people in our community, but also because we thought that the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty was being violated first and foremost. And what should we non-Cherokees do if Cherokee Nation didn't want to be so public about this? And they didn't. They also have been very reluctant to go public until very recently in a really strong way against Elizabeth Warren. It took them some years to do that. But eventually I and other colleagues grasped that playing Indian is representative of an unrelenting problem in our academic world, and it's something we're trying to deal with in the prairies in Canada as well. We're trying to figure out how to have sets of rules for identification of faculty, students, and staff that are not based on self-identification alone. It's not easy. Very difficult to do. So one of the things that occurred to us is how could we study, write, and speak in the service of Indigenous self-determination while not challenging the fundamentally anti-Indigenous colonial appropriation that is playing Indian. As with all forms of structural racism and settler colonialism, a gauge of what is ethical behavior is not simply individual good intentions, but rather how individual actions are both shaped by and loop back to reinforce structures of white supremacy. So So I was both shocked and not shocked by Andrea Smith. As a PhD, she has research credentials. She's anybody who knows her, she's a brilliant woman. The overwhelming evidence that her lineages all trace back to non-Indigenous people should have mattered to her. They should matter to Elizabeth Warren too. But such situations are common even among highly educated people. We've seen this more recently with Warren, a highly lauded law school professor. She would not accept, back in 2012, detailed, well-researched Cherokee genealogies done by professional genealogists from a wealth of archives. Despite their evidence, she did not stop claiming Cherokee ancestry. She persists with her family mythologies, despite all of her ancestors being well documented as white people in records going back to well before the Trail of Tears. If you're interested in the details of her ancestry, there's a blog by a Cherokee genealogist. It's Twyla Barnes, and the blog is called Polly's Granddaughter. And she's got some really interesting posts with census records and alongside Cherokee Nation records. So it's quite interesting if you're into those details. So the US citizenry seems overwhelmingly invested in disappearing Indigenous peoples as distinct from the multicultural national body. Not that they necessarily understand their investment in our disappearance. I don't think people are doing this, I don't think they're lying. I think there's something much more insidious going on that's got to do with a nationalist mythology. Indigeneity must be eliminated as a separate category in the nation. If not by extermination, then by assimilation, and both of those things can go on simultaneously. Aileen Morton Robinson explains that, quote, the conceptual links between the privileges and benefits that flow from American citizenship to Native American dispossession remain invisible. Instead, slavery, war, and migration are the narratives by which the historically contingent positionality of whiteness unfolds. Perhaps Morton Robinson surmises the selective historical amnesia displayed is partly the result of scholars not being epistemologically and ontologically open to being a disoriented, displaced, and diasporic racialized subject whose existence within the nation state is predicated on the continuing divestment of Indigenous people's sovereign rights. So the more recent Joseph Boyden case, who in here has heard of Joseph Boyden? Okay, not many of you. All right. There's more, in Canada, they kind of know about American cases, but you all don't tend to know about them. I suggest you watch CBC and EPTN, but it's hard to get down here. Okay, so EPTN is Aboriginal People's Television Network, and I'm going to be talking about that. So Joseph Boyden actually lives in New Orleans part of the year too, but in December 2016, APTN's Jorge Barrera broke a story of renowned Canadian author Joseph Boyden's, quote, shape-shifting identity. Boyden is a prize-winning and widely known fiction and historical writer who, quote, over the years has variously claimed his family's roots extended to the Métis, Mi'kmaq, Ojibwe, and Nipmuc peoples. He also traces his Ojibwe roots in part to his uncle Earl Boyden, who in the mid-20th century went by the alias Injun Joe, and who dressed in a headdress and sold faux Indian crafts to tourists in Algonquin Park, Ontario. The APTN article cites documentation of Earl Boyden admitting he had, quote, no Indian blood. Debate erupted in the Canadian press and on social media regarding Joseph Boyden's right to claim to be Indigenous based on dubious ancestry claims. The New York Times picked up the story several weeks later in January 2017. Many Indigenous commentators have focused on his obligations to be forthcoming about his ancestry and connections with the communities he claims. Some also focus on the many opportunities awarded to Boyden as an Indigenous writer. Others note that as a highly sought-after public commentator, he displaces the voices of those with much stronger ties to Indigenous communities. This is especially troubling when he speaks on important issues, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where his understanding has been shown to be facile and a bit uncritical. Predictably, Boyden has elicited no small amount of sympathy from non-Indigenous commentators on social media and during radio interviews. A few Indigenous commentators have also taken the position that I originally took with Andrea Smith, that only those from the Indigenous communities he claims should actually weigh in on the issue. But I no longer find that argument compelling. Boyden's playing Indian has a far-reaching effect beyond the Indigenous peoples he claims. So far, no Indigenous community has come forward to claim him as a descendant, and this is crucial if we are to defend our collective political identities. Individual Indigenous people and families have expressed sympathy for him and asserted their ongoing relations with him. A prominent Indigenous filmmaker declared publicly that she would ceremonially adopt him, which Indigenous people in North America do commonly do ceremonial adoptions of each other. Friends will establish a formal brother and sister bond, or we might adopt non-Indigenous people in order to similarly formalize an intended relative relationship. But this is not the same as an Indigenous people claiming someone as a citizen of that people, as someone who has a shared history with the community. Or it's not the same as sharing somebody as a broader, sort of not made kin, but kin that has been forged over a long time in community. So one thing I like to remind people of is that you can be kin to Indigenous people without being Indigenous yourself. Boyden's original Shifting Indigenous Ancestry stories and his responses to the APTN story and the subsequent social media response have been vague and also reminiscent of Smith's Cherokee ancestry claims and responses to the public challenge to those claims. So Andrea Smith asserted in a blog response to the press, and I quote, "I have always been and will always be Cherokee. I have consistently identified myself based on what I knew to be true. My enrollment status does not impact my Cherokee identity or my continued commitment to organizing for justice for Native communities." Her wording is adept. However, what she once knew to be true was eventually, and for 2 decades, confronted with evidence to the contrary. Same with Elizabeth Warren for 7 years now. Notice how Smith attempts to deflect critique of her shifting disputed claims to Cherokee ancestry by segueing to a sentence denouncing the importance of tribal enrollment, which is not the issue that she was being challenged about. Plenty of actual Indigenous people do not qualify for tribal enrollment, my daughter, my niece, and my nephew included. A key reason for debate within tribal communities for revising citizenship criteria because we can't get our own relatives enrolled, so we debate this all the time. It was widely known that Smith was not a Cherokee citizen. The actual challenge to her claims is that Cherokee genealogists find her ancestry to be all non-Cherokee and all non-Indigenous. Therefore, Cherokee Nation explicitly challenged her right to identify as Cherokee at all. The Indian Country Today letter that set off the media response around her story very clearly stated, "Our concerns about Andrea Smith do not emerge from status, forms of enrollment or non-enrollment, federal recognition or lack thereof. They are not about blood quantum or other biologically essentialist notions of identity. Rather, our concerns are about the profound need for transparency." And from Joseph Boyden, we hear the following in response to CBC interviewer Candy Palmer's question, "Are you Indigenous?" "Absolutely," he says. "I am the person I've always shown myself to be, both privately and in public, and my family says. I'm a white kid from Willowdale with Native roots. I have always said very clearly and carefully to the public a small part of me is Indigenous, but it's a big part of who I am." Like Smith, Boyden uses the word always and invokes the idea of traditional family stories. And I'll quote some more from him. He says, "My family has always had our stories from the beginning of my father and his brothers, his Indian brother Earl, and how they had to protect each other and hide that Indian blood. This has been an ongoing search for not just me, but for all of my family all of our life. And we've looked for the roots that the stories tell. And you can't sometimes just rely on the written records from the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s. This is a story about my identity and my lifelong search for that identity. And my family's stories have always compelled me and other members of my family to continue this search. Who do I say I am as I come out as a writer into this country? My family said, you are the stories that we've always known, and so you're allowed to say that." So similarly to Smith, Joseph Boyden attempts to avoid calls for transparency by referencing the concept of blood quantum and elsewhere Indian status, which again was not an argument being made against him. So he says, no, it's not about blood quantum now. This is who I've always expressed as myself and my family have said we are. So it's common for many diverse people to ask me and others who talk about this topic why these cases matter. Don't we have more important things to worry about? I get this daily from trolls on Twitter. But they're produced from the same history of white privilege to name and define the categories by which we must all live. Claiming the right to define Indigenous identity is one more colonial appropriation in a long line of colonial acts that have dispossessed Indigenous people of land, water, grave goods, including bones for anthropological study, and even our very blood for the extraction of DNA. All of these dispossessions are justified to build this settler state and its institutions. So these are not simply misguided individuals or individuals exercising their rights to define themselves. Boyden's and Smith's understanding that they have the individual right to claim Indigenous identity, absent confirmation by the communities claimed, demonstrates their individual activation of systemic white privilege co-constituted with a long history of appropriating valuable resources from Indigenous peoples. Our identities are simply one more object they claim the right to take. So Indigenous people's simultaneous erasure in the dominant US racial imaginary alongside our actual survival as peoples that refuse to be fully absorbed into the political and physical bodies of others compels a phenomenon that historian Philip Deloria calls playing Indian. Joseph Boyden, Andrea Smith, and Elizabeth Warren do something long common in US American and Canadian culture when they insist on their unfounded claims to Indigenous ancestry and identity. Amidst a rich historical archive, Deloria draws on British writer D.H. Lawrence's analysis of an essentially unfinished and incomplete US American consciousness that produced an unparalleled national identity crisis. It's funny, reading from early 19th century to now, this so captures the present moment as well. Lawrence saw the Indian as, quote, at the heart of American ambivalence. Savage Indians served Americans as oppositional figures against whom one might imagine a civilized national self. Coded as freedom, however, wild Indianness proved equally attractive, setting up a dialectic of simultaneous desire and repulsion. Lawrence wrote that no place exerts its full influence upon a newcomer until the old inhabitant is dead or absorbed. Therefore, the unexpressed spirit of America could not be fulfilled without Indians either being exterminated or assimilated into white America. Deloria summarizes, quote, the indeterminacy of American identity stems in part from the nation's inability to deal with Indian people. Americans wanted to feel natural affinity with the continent, and it was Indians who could teach them such aboriginal closeness. Yet in order to control the landscape, they had to destroy the original inhabitants. Half-articulated Indianness continually lurks behind various efforts at American self-imagination. Deloria documents a range of playing Indian practices that have occurred since the US Revolutionary War and before, from 18th century images representing the Indian as the oppressed American colonist, to the red face of the Boston Tea Party, to 19th century fraternal orders, to the 20th century with its Boy Scouts, hobbyist powwows, and New Age movements. We have 4 centuries of settler identity crisis focused on playing Indian. That's why it's so funny to me when people say, why are you making a big deal out of Elizabeth Warren? Like, why did this just come up now? Why are you bringing this up now? Because they can only see it within the light of the US election, right? 400 years, not just now. So just the incredible, pervasive ignorance of our history. So as long as I can remember, Native people in the US have laughed at how many non-Natives we meet who claim to have a Cherokee princess or a Cherokee great-grandmother in their family lineages. It's like all of these people speak from the same script, which they do, according to Philip Deloria's scholarship. In fact, the problem of playing Indian is so pervasive that in the early 21st century, there are over 200 fabricated Cherokee tribes throughout the South. They are actually 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Cersei Sturm's book, Becoming Indian, provides a nuanced ethnography of those groups. It's not very widely read or cited, actually. If you go to that blog I mentioned to earlier, Polly's granddaughter, she's got a list of many of these fake Cherokee tribes. And they're groups that are weighing in on sort of conversations about Cherokee culture and history. Some of them have also tried to make claims to artifacts and remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And the thing is, most non-natives don't understand, right, the difference between legitimate tribal communities and all of these non-profit ones. And so when you've got an uneducated populace making decisions related to NAGPRA and things like that, there are some other kinds of kind of immediate ramifications negative for us of people doing this. So just to talk a little bit about Canada too, there's an upsurge in whites in Canada claiming to be Métis, which they often misunderstand to not be a distinct post-contact Indigenous people, but they use the word Métis as a racialized term for those of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry. This is the way in which Boyden initially claimed to be Indigenous. At one point he said he was Métis. I've also seen people with no affiliation with the Métis Nation or people claim to be Métis based on having, say, both Cree and French lineage. So it's not only white folks who do it, sometimes even other Indigenous people misuse the term Métis as meaning simply mixed race. But more often, these claims to being Métis are based on one long ago suspected or proven Indigenous ancestor in a family tree otherwise lush with European branches. So often those cases are very similar to the kinds of Cherokee claims you see throughout the South. There's considerable criticism by respected scholars of Métis history and politics of this misreading and appropriation of an Indigenous people's identity, especially by whites desiring to shift racially away from whiteness. Indigenous peoples are plagued by those who play Indian at Halloween, and the football stands are very often in real-life attempts to pass. Redface regularly evokes public sympathy and accusations of identity policing, lateral violence, and focusing on unimportant issues. The lamentations include, "We are honoring you with mascots. Aren't there more important things to worry about? Those who claim Indigenous ancestry are bringing attention to your issues. You should be grateful. They do good work for Native people. Don't hold them to colonial standards of blood quantum." Such defensiveness circulates through cyberspace even when Indigenous people get national media attention for marching in protest or trend a new hashtag on Twitter, "Not your mascot." It persists even when those in redface have no demonstrable Indigenous ancestry despite claiming such, which they often do to deflect critique. This was an ad that, this is one of the companies I write about in my book. I'm not sure, I think maybe they're still in business. They've tried to do DNA tests for tribal governments in the US and First Nations in Canada. But they do parentage tests. Tribes use a different kind of DNA test than the kind that Elizabeth Warren used. You can't get that from this image. But it doesn't, in some ways it doesn't matter in terms of the public consumption of these images because the public doesn't understand that tribal governments are using a really different technology than the genetic ancestry technologies that say 23andMe or Family Tree DNA produce. Because both of those types of companies, even though the technologies are applied quite differently, will use this similar kind of stereotypical imagery. And I just love this picture because it so reminds me of that, maybe many of you weren't around in the 1970s. I don't know if there's people in this room. But in the 1970s, when I was a kid at powwows, you would often have those end of the trail blankets and posters. This was like a big image back then, this like slumped over poor sad Indian on his horse, like looking into the sunset, because we were vanishing and dying in the face. We couldn't survive in the face of civilization. I don't know why Native people like this, but this was all over the place. So this is such a contemporary replica of that. It's always this like prototypical Native American male in silhouette from the side, looking super traditional with the sun setting on him. So in the early 21st century, new technological developments meet the long-standing social technology of playing Indian. DNA ancestry testing and genetic genealogy, also conditioned by settler state racial formations, emerged to capitalize on a plethora of self-actualizing citizen consumers. Different DNA test takers voice different stakes in their Indian ancestry claims. Some are more interested in the combined genealogical and genomic practices and do not attempt racial or identity shifting based on DNA tests. I have a whole chapter in my book about those people who are using the DNA test extensively but remaining identified as white and not at all thinking about race shifting. I didn't expect that from them. There's a class argument that's kind of central to why they do that. But in this talk, I highlight a different set of ancestry seekers who long for a particular tribal identity. They search for Indigenous lineages in the molecular rivers of their genetic admixture to, quote, know who they really are. Some in this group seek tribal enrollment or other forms of recognition and status for themselves or their children. They are mostly, but not all, white. I regularly hear from people via email, on Twitter, Facebook messaging, during lectures, who have a desire to locate an Indian obscured high up in the branches of their ancestral trees. Some have no genealogical knowledge but a suspicion. Some have seen a faded photograph of an ancestor with so-called Indian features. They often say high cheekbones and olive skin. I think Elizabeth Warren said that too. Sometimes children born via anonymous sperm donation exhibit such features. Rarely a photographed ancestor wears Native American dress. Others simply identify with Native American culture. There's actually a case where, I can't remember where I read this, there are quite a few women in Australia who are trying to figure out how to trace the Native American ancestry of their common sperm donor. This person apparently said that they're Cherokee. I said, I doubt it. I doubt they are. I think they're one of these type, but that's really interesting, right? I think it's fascinating. So there's people moving all around the world who are kind of spreading this Cherokee story. So the sperm donor thing is really interesting. So many in the US have stories handed down through the generations, actually. So this isn't just, again, as I said, one person making this up. These are multi-generational stories. Now, most of the stories that one hears are about Cherokee ancestry. This is the most common. But I often, in traveling and working and living throughout the US South, the other claims that I've heard are that people are Choctaw, Apache, or Blackfoot. Again, common across the South, which, given the way that peoples migrated, not likely. In Canada, claims to Métis ancestry appear to be the most common, although these can involve a search for the lineages of other Indigenous people too, for example, Anishinaabe or Cree. A key aspect of claims to Métis heritage is often the failure to distinguish Métis with a capital M, which refers to the notion of a nation or a people proper with inherent self-governance authorities. So failing to distinguish that from Métis small m, which refers to the notion of a mixed blood or mixed ancestry person. Métis capital M is a people-based concept, while Métis small m is a racial concept. But this distinction is not understood by most people. So I've taken probably 24 stories and combined them into 5 vignettes. I've changed genders, tribal affiliations, and narratives. I've made them briefer. I've changed names for anonymity, and then I've taken some poetic license. So these consumers construct Indigenous histories, representations, and so-called Native American genetic markers as technologies of the South and the nation. So, oh, sorry, I went back. Okay. These are just some excerpts from what I'm going to read. So the first person, Eva, writes me, Dear Dr. TallBear, our family is confused. We cannot name our tribal roots. One great-grandmother was Native American, on the other side a great-grandfather too, both from the southeast. Exactly where we cannot tell. Documents were lost, nativeness a thing of shame back then. We descendants passed as white, missionized, assimilated. Our heritage was denied to us. This is a deep and painful loss. I have rounded up relatives for DNA testing. A still living aunt, an uncle, a cousin or two. We are growing older. There is not much time left. We need to do sampling as quickly as possible. My questions are simple. Which tests? For which lineages? Which company? How do I find my people? Joe writes, Dear Dr. TallBear, you are busy. I know. I will understand if you do not reply. I will be so grateful if you do. My paternal great-grandmother, I am told, was a full-blooded Pequot Indian. And there is an old family photograph, yes, a photograph of a woman dressed as an Indian. Yet we come from a place in the east landscaped with stories of vanishing natives, the tribes declared extinct. We are not extinct. Today we seek recognition, but we were assimilated, our ancestors categorized as black, white, mulatto, out of existence as Native Americans. DNA may help us prove who we really are. Which company? Which tests? June writes, My Indian soul has awakened. I didn't have to do a lot of poetic license. People would ask when I was young, are you Indian? No, I would shake my head. But after many winters, I began to walk the red road. I seek knowledge. I wear a medicine bundle. I made a woman's lodge, a medicine wheel. Even more people now ask me, are you an Indian? I hear my great-grandmother was a full-blood Apache. My soul longs for the truth. Does Indian blood course through my veins? If so, I want to be a part of my people. Now, down to business. I require a reliable, affordable DNA testing. Please advise. Jack writes, How Kola? Okay, so Kola is the word for friend in Lakota, but I'm Dakota, so it should be Koda. So anyway, I didn't like that's really funny. How Kola? Dr. TallBear, did you know the Cherokee have a direct lineage to the Middle East? This is a common story. Yeah. They appear quite different from other North American tribes. The geneticists do not want this to be true. They refuse to see our old world roots. We are rejected by the Cherokee Nation too. They with their 1/1000th degree of blood, they are not full bloods. Who are they to reject us? They do not act Cherokee. They do not speak the language. Both the Cherokee and the geneticists deny us. Once enough people are bled and analyzed, when the DNA data sets are large enough, they will one day have no choice but to accept what they deny. One of the purveyors of this myth of Cherokee originality in the Middle East actually operates a DNA testing company. Annabelle writes, "Dear Dr. TallBear, forgive my presumption, but might you provide me some guidance? I had a baby. I used a sperm donor. He identified as black, white, and red. Many black folks talk of Native American ancestry with nothing beyond vague stories. I know. I am black. Yet my daughter, she has Native American features. So do other children conceived using the same donor. We mothers communicate. We want to know which tribe our children descend from. I do not care about enrollment, but it is so important for them to know who their ancestors are. I would be so grateful for advice. Is there a test for tribal affiliation on the technological horizon?" Are you getting tired yet? I'm standing, sorry. So settler state citizens in both the US and Canada conflate indigeneity with racial essence figured through lineal biological ancestry alone, without reference to Indigenous peoples' more collective citizenship and kinship rules. These nation-state citizens are often, but not always, white. I focus on settler colonial state hegemony founded in white supremacy and which all of the state's citizens are capable of shoring up. Thus, I see racially marginalized citizens as also potentially complicit in settler colonial appropriations of Indigenous resources, including DNA-informed identity claims. So Jenny Reardon and I, she's another feminist technoscience scholar, we've written about Cheryl Harris's groundbreaking 1993 Harvard Law Review article, "Whiteness is Property," in reference to genetic discourse. So Cheryl Harris shows that the power to define race categories and regulate racial practices is inherent to whiteness, and that property and race develop strong links in the US-American context. Harris argues that whiteness and property in fact became so strongly linked that whiteness itself became a form of valued property that accords those who possess it rights and privileges that the American legal system defends. Those rights and privileges include the right to control the legal meaning of group identity, including the identities of, say, Black and Indigenous and other peoples whose racialization and subordination as other is necessary to solidify the exclusive parameters of whiteness. So they've got to define everybody who's not white so they can keep all that good white stuff to themselves, right? So Indigenous peoples, for example, are seen in a white supremacist logic as incapable of developing in a manner similar to the modern industrial state that is constituted by productive property-owning individuals. That was one of the kind of dominant ideas used to subjugate Native peoples. We're stuck in this middle point of evolution and we can't develop resources into value in the way that white citizens could. So that meant that Indigenous resources, including our bodies, cultures, histories, and lands, then become available for the appropriation in the project of nation building. We're not using them anyway, we're just wasting them, right? One of the clever tricks of whiteness is that in its consolidation of the black-white binary, red as a race category has come to be viewed as absorbable into the white body, the national body, in a way that black has not. You saw that with Mary, right? So, fascinating response. And some of the race literature deals with this. One's whiteness is not necessarily threatened by absorbing red into that. So this made the appropriation of Native American biological and cultural patrimony possible within the US exceptionalist imagination. We Indigenous people were not supposed to survive. Our death was a foregone conclusion. The Indian was to be outright eliminated through massacres and disease. Intellectual and policy projects in the 19th and early 20th century attempted to hurry that along, all aimed toward the cultural and genealogical absorption of red into the national body. We know that in earlier centuries, federal lawmakers decided which Indians had become white and assimilated enough to be designated as private landowners. We know that those categorizations were then used to shrink the number of Indians in collectively held tribal land bases. So if you administratively define an Indian, or say a Sioux, I'm using whatever language was used at that time, if you administratively define those persons out of existence, then you could then take vast acreages of tribally collective held land and you could turn it into individual land. So defining Indians as not sufficiently Indian freed up a lot of excess land for white settlers to claim. The first tribal registers were actually developed for the sake of white people's land management. The US government and its anthropological, legal, and historical advisors also decide the standards of ethnic and historical authenticity of tribes as groups, not only their individual citizens. Usually white disciplinarians weigh from their disciplinary standpoints evidence of cultural and political continuity before federally recognizing tribes. And tribal recognition is always related to claiming rights to resources. These relations between whiteness and property extend to the genome sciences that also maintain settler nationalist regimes of race and property. Indigenous DNA is a new natural resource that indigenous peoples possess, but that the modern citizen and the settler state have the ability to develop into knowledge and valued property. Indigenous DNA, like indigenous land, water, and mineral resources, even our children, is understood as the proper inheritance of the settler state. Genome scientists, like bone scientists and European and American explorers before them, have the power to rename and re-identify indigenous bodies according to their, not our, definitions. They redefine us as molecular property and properties, with techniques fine-tuned on the backs, from the bones, and the blood of indigenous people. Genome science companies like 23andMe, who analyzed Elizabeth Warren's DNA, see an actual return on scientific investment in the harvesting of our DNA. Scientists and consumers of their DNA tests further sustain the colonial project of claiming and naming by re-narrating our histories and identities according to their genomic truths. So this is a quote that's really stuck with me ever since. I don't remember when I saw it. I saw it in somebody else's article, Robert Proctor. The idea of evolution has conditioned an odd understanding that we are what we were and not what we became. So I'm going to ask, so why are we not what we became? I'm really interested in becoming and who we are becoming. So here's another vignette. A soft-spoken young man stood in the cavernous auditorium, and he said, "In our genealogy, we have ancestors listed in the Dawes Commission reports as Cherokees. This was a revelation. Hard proof after so many family stories of our native origins. You study DNA testing. Can you tell me then, are we Indians? Are we African Americans? Tell me, how do we know who we are?" So I hear some version of this question often. I get both weary of it and sad to hear it. Given the reality of our ongoing becomings, why are so many of us prone to think we are or should be what certain of our ancestors were, and not what we became or are becoming? Which social biological networks, both human and other than human, are we actually entangled with? Who had the questioner already become in his young life? Who was he becoming? Surely he must know who he is. Now, certainly there might be relations he can cultivate in order to connect in his life with the Cherokee collectivity, even if he cannot be enrolled. Some people raised within Indigenous community also face the same limitation, or the young man may choose not to do that connecting. Lived relations, not DNA or material semiotic blood alone. That said, blood relations are an important starting point for crafting lived relations, whether that happens at birth or later in life. So when I denounce blood fetishism, it's not to say that blood does not matter at all. Many Indigenous communities have said it matters, but in ways that they are constantly seeking to elaborate, think through, and sometimes shift, often in wily response to colonial conditions. What I reject is genes or human biological descent alone, and as asserted by non-Indigenous communities, including scientific thinkers, as able to stand for complicated sets of social material relations that happen all the way from the cellular level to the street level to the galactic level, for we are materially connected not only to humans but to non-humans and on this planet, and to the star people beyond this planet. So that's what I like to foreground as opposed to this gene fetishism, right? It's not that genes aren't a part of that, but they don't stand for all of that. If one places overwhelming emphasis on, quote, Indigenous blood as a connector to peoples, that seems to miss the point of what it is to ever become as an Indigenous person in relation to the collectivities, both human and other than human, through which our peoples emerge and are sustained. Becoming is not an individual body's enterprise, even considering the molecular and material inputs of one's many thousands of ancestors, but rather we become with. Perhaps instead of we are what we were, we should consider that we are what we become. It is then our responsibility to work to keep becoming, to work with, to relate with, but in ways that are mindful when settler colonial inheritances, including the capacity to play Indian, are claimed. So in his January 12, 2017 interview with Candy Palmer on CBC's Q, Boyden revealed in moving language the collectivity with whom he has become a human, the collectivity with whom he takes solace in times of stress. Times of stress, that this is particularly after the APTN article and media controversy. That collectivity with whom he takes solace is not an Indigenous collectivity. You can read along. He said, "I'm as much land as I am anything. Our family, so much of them, has ended back up on the land where we are from. This is who we are. We are as much grounded in the land as anyone, and that is a big, huge part of who I am. My mother, after all of these years, finally she said to me, the voice is the land." She is very Catholic, and she did a rosary, and she said, "I had a realization, the voice, my voice, your voice is the land, and the land is God." We've come out of these holidays feeling stronger and knowing even more that we're grounded in who we are and where we come from. And I am in no way ashamed to continue to say that I am a white kid from Willowdale with Native roots. So, of course there is no reason to be ashamed of his big, loud, raucous, beautiful Irish-Canadian Catholic family. Those are all descriptors that Joseph Boyden used in that interview with Candy Palmer. The statement he made deflects attention, like his invocation of blood quantum, from the real issues. Boyden's Indigenous critics do not ask him to be ashamed of being Irish-Canadian and Catholic. They ask him to be accountable for the Indigenous voice he has claimed, the space he has taken using that voice and the stories he tells about who he claims, stories which have no demonstrable basis in truth. As for the land, he makes a problematic claim of settler ownership when he says we are as much grounded in the land as anyone. This is a clear moment of his settler desire to belong in this place, desire that clearly conditions the will to play Indian. On the other hand, it is possible, and I think desirable, for settlers and other relative newcomers to take account of the agency of these lands and waters and our other than human relatives who have lived here since time immemorial. It is possible and desirable for non-Indigenous people to try and belong respectfully to these places, but respectful entanglements on this continent preclude appropriating Indigenous peoples' voices, narratives, and identities, and they include recognizing Indigenous self-determination, including Indigenous criteria for both official citizenship and more expansive but not unlimited forms of social belonging. Again, one does not have to be us to be good kin with us, to relate well. So can you handle a couple minutes on Foucault? I really miss having a mic, like I'm getting deeply wings. Okay. So you can't see it probably very closely, but an anthropologist who will remain, he doesn't want credit, photoshopped this picture of Columbia with Elizabeth Warren's face. I know, but it's just, if you know that painting, right? And you know what it's doing, it's manifest destiny. You've got the Indians in the foreground and the buffalo going into the darkness and lights coming from the east, and she's got a book. Another historian told me what that book was. It was like English literature or something. And then here come the covered wagons and the trains, all the modern technology at the time, and you see the steamboats in the background and the coaches, and you can't see it in the crop version here, but there's also farmers coming with plows, right? So this is American, I called it American Progress Redux. because there's all these progressive narratives of the white savior coming to help us, or Elizabeth Warren's campaign and her claims are completely laden with the same kind of, like, nothing has changed since the 19th century. They just recycle the same tropes, right? Just the technology's changed. We have DNA now instead of the plow and the steam engine. All right, so, we'll talk about Foucault and Indigenous death as a nation's life. Foucault's concept of biopower helps us see the clever trick in settler colonial maneuvers, bringing Indigenous peoples to the point of death, then resurrecting us within the nationalist body, its institutions, and within the bodies and lives of individual non-native citizens. Unlike under the monarchs of old, who had the power to make die or let live, biopower fosters life or disallows it to the point of death. It makes live or lets die. Indigenous DNA has been made to live, even while genomics, as part of the national project, continues to narrate Indigenous death, continues to help constitute the relentless settler nationalist narrative of our vanishing. Biopower seeks to regulate and control morbidity in populations, a key concept conditioning genomic sampling. We can talk about that in Q&A if you need more on sampling and how that's vanishing us. So indeed, Indigenous peoples are reanimated, not as we define ourselves, as explicitly political, place-based peoples that resist the politically assimilative state, but we are reanimated according to genome science's terms, which is, by the way, run by mostly white guys, and those are, we're reanimated as genetic populations. If it is inevitable that Indigenous peoples are always dying in the face of Western civilization, yet Indigenous existence is crucial for both US-American nationalist coherence and for the production of the multicultural global genomic subject, Indigenous DNA as a proxy for bodies and life helps bring death within the realm of power. Indigenous death is far enough along to justify appropriating Indigenous biological resources, but then it's ultimately pushed back to the brink of extinction when Indigenous genome knowledge, as well as our ceremonies and our images and our cultural patrimony, are produced for consumption by a 21st century knowledge society that is hell-bent on individual self-knowledge via consumption. Indigenous patrimony, real or imagined, both biological and cultural, is used to signify the life and essence of long-dead ancestors or founding populations. This helps connect living people, Indigenous genome knowledge, and identity consumers to those ancestors, thus intensifying not the life and vitality of Indigenous peoples, but the lives and vitality of the settler state. In short, the death of Indigenous peoples is simultaneously always occurring, but ultimately avoided when Native American DNA seekers tap into Indigenous lives immortalized in our biological patrimony. Cells, blood, and molecular sequences are harvested from Indigenous bodies, then frozen out of place and time for current and future research and in anticipation of future, more advanced laboratory techniques of analysis. Indigenous death is simultaneously always occurring, but ultimately avoided as Indigenous knowledge and identity seekers tap into Indigenous lives, which they see immortalized in representational patrimony. Our histories and ancestors are harvested in very partial ways from molecular archives and recombined with nationalist and settler family mythologies, then used to support moral claims to our peoples and territories. Playing Indian, whether in real-life attempts to pass or by dressing up as mascots in roaring coliseums, relies upon and perpetuates our vanishing, and therefore the disappearance of our moral claims to this place. I'm going to give you one more quick case study. So on January 5th, 2017, Jody TallBear Esquire filed suit in federal district court in Washington, D.C. against the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE. My sister's complaint, TallBear v. Moniz, centers on the pervasive presence of Washington Redskins paraphernalia in DOE headquarters. She charges DOE with race and national origin discrimination, a hostile work environment, and retaliation. TallBear began working as a senior policy advisor to the director of DOE's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity in 2011. Part of her job was Native American stakeholder involvement in energy issues. TallBear's director, LaDoris Harris, also oversaw DOE's Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Civil Rights. TallBear's work within DOE and other federal agencies, therefore, also addressed anti-Native American discrimination. I'm going to quote from the complaint. Ms. TallBear recognized the scarcity of Native American employees at DOE and the pervasive stereotypical images and racial slurs related to Native Americans represented and promoted by the Washington Redskins paraphernalia in her workplace. As part of her DOE mission, she attempted through presentations to DOE and to other federal agencies to raise an awareness of the harm caused to Native Americans by the stereotypical images, such as Indian mascot portrayals and the disparaging slur Redskins, which is directly tied to the historical bounty hunting of Native Americans. During 2012, Jody TallBear began notifying DOE leadership of problematic imagery and language. Not only did Director Harris refuse to take action within the agency, but she forbade TallBear from speaking within her capacity as a federal employee to other federal agencies about the racist damage done by Native American mascots. She would have to do such invited talks on her personal time. DOE officials went even farther in their attempts to curtail TallBear speaking out against anti-Indigenous racism in the federal workplace. Agency leadership ostracized and isolated her, stripped her of her title, job responsibilities, and derailed her career path. Director Harris not only removed TallBear from professional duties for which she was best qualified, but also denied or directed others to deny TallBear's request for detail opportunities with other energy policy offices when TallBear attempted to mitigate the damage done to her career. A second stark passage in the TallBear v. Moniz complaint is when DOE Deputy General Counsel for General Law, Susan Beard, acknowledged that, quote, Indian mascot portrayals are prevalent at DOE, but stated DOE would do nothing to address it because two wrongs don't make a right, unquote. She was referring to denying TallBear's request to make presentations to federal agencies with visuals of cartoon critiques from national newspapers showing whites and other racial groups as mascots. This Beard reason could open up the agency to litigation. The TallBear v. Moniz complaint argues that banning Jody TallBear from educating federal employees about the racism of Indian mascots in order to protect non-Native American employees from being offended places Native Americans as a lower priority for protection from harm. Why is it that Indigenous people can be so commonly objectified in such stereotypical and offensive ways? Why is this acceptable even by consciously anti-racist people and institutions? So we come back to biopower, making live or letting die. This helps explain how Indigenous representations are claimed as an inheritance by and for those who are not vanished, those made more vital in their inheritance of everything supposedly left behind by the vanishing noble Indian. Today, the Redskin, though no less a manifestation of white supremacy, is not a scalp taken as a trophy, proof that the land emptied was ready to be allotted, measured, opened, farmed, and mined. The 21st century Redskin or Chief is the costume donned at a sporting event. A trophy to be worn after the original Indigenous bodies must surely be vanished, long ago subdued by the light of manifest destiny that chased darkness and Indians to the west, to the edge of life. As from the land, Indigenous peoples must be absent from the roaring coliseums, not possibly here in the 21st century to witness on ESPN the red-faced, cheap paint, Halloween store headdresses, caricatures doing ridiculous dances on gymnasium floors, or on sports jerseys worn by many diverse Americans who play and flaunt the conquered dead they imagine. At the moment of subdual, Indians become ancestors and all the multicultural citizens our rightful inheritors. So I got an update from my sister today. I don't understand how her legalese. The case is still being, part of it's been thrown out, part of it's being considered. They're probably going to appeal, but they've got to go through the part that wasn't thrown out before they, anyway. I could, if somebody was an attorney, I could get it. Anyway, I don't get it. It's partly still active. So I'm done. Thank you. Of course, I really am more used to giving public lectures now. I'm like, it's a drag to give academic talks with bunches of citations and quotes in them. It's just so like not fun. Good, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could have elaborated on, and probably some of your questions will anticipate that. Yes.
Yeah, so I'll just break the ice by saying thank you for this wonderful talk, and I would actually personally love to hear you say a little bit more about the sampling issues that you alluded to in your talk. I would love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, so sampling disappears us because, you know, for some good reasons, human population geneticists are looking for the unadmixed subject, right? And I mean, I know there's a more complicated definition of unadmixed. To me, it sounds like a fancy way of saying not mixed, right? So, you know, when they're wanting indigenous DNA or the DNA of traditional peoples, like if indigenous is a term that can't be used where they're sampling so easily, they'll want somebody who's got 3 or 4 grandparents from that community or village. Well, that in of itself is a denial of colonialism, right? Like, even and there's actually been sampling done in my tribe, and they're like, these are Sistan, Wapton, Oyate samples. I'm like, I've got a Cheyenne Arapaho grandfather, I've got a Turtle Mountain Chippewa great grandmother, I've got Korean Métis, like, well, they don't even, and we're all like this, right? So both pre-colonization and post-colonization, indigenous peoples were moving around and trading and connecting, and there's no such thing as a person pre or post-colonization who's pure this tribe or that tribe. And so there's, but they're looking for that because they are looking, their research questions, they're looking for a clearer view back to the founding populations because they're interested in this kind of immigration or migration narrative, right? When and how did people get here from other parts of the world? And so it's not that those aren't legitimate questions, but they are questions that I think typical non-native people steeped in an immigrant kind of story are interested in. And in order to answer questions within that typical immigrant story, they've got to look for the pure native, right? And where we have indigenous genome scientists and I work with a lot of critical genome scientists, not only indigenous people, but other people of color, queer folks, disabled people who are bringing indigenous, feminist, crip, black theory, like every kind of critical theory you can imagine, they're bringing to science. There's a group of young critical scientists, and they're making a lot of the same critiques of the way that science has gazed upon and marginalized and demeaned their bodies and made them deviant, right? How did I get on that? Oh, so they're asking different kinds of questions, really different kinds of questions. So, yeah. Anyway, that was a more,
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
yeah. Yes.
I'm a geneticist, and I'm not interested in population migrations at all.
What do you work on?
On
People or-
diseases.
Do you work on people though?
I'm working on people, yes. I'm working on identifying genes that cause congenital diseases.
What kind of diseases?
Diseases that you are born with.
Oh, okay. I only work with human population geneticists, yeah. Well, not totally, but yeah.
And I think it is harming a lot all minorities not to be part of the human genetics population pool because we are all different.
Because of the medical stuff.
As a medical thing. Yeah, medically harming.
Yeah, yeah.
Those who have diseases that are rare, that are asking the geneticist to help to understand why a baby is born with a disease. And then we find many variants. We know that we find many variants in any minority that is not white, basically, or majority that is not white. And we cannot help these people because we don't know which variant is just the norm in their population and which one is causing the disease. So.
Yeah, so the part, it's hard for us to trust the dominant culture doing genetics, right, to have our interests at heart. This is partly why, as I kind of stopped studying geneticists as anthropological subjects, and I started working with these young critical geneticists. So we have a program called the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics, and they're working with some of these other young aspiring scientists as well. So we are thinking about training a more diverse scientific workforce, right, to ask different kinds of questions and to work methodologically and ethically in ways that are more in line with our sets of cultural ethics. But it's kind of a chicken and egg problem because what we've seen is that it's hard to stay in science when you feel culturally alienated, socially alienated. We know this from women too, right? And it really helps when somebody has a PI that is more accommodating of different worldviews, so it's like you need a diverse kind of PI in order to cultivate a more diverse workforce, and that's difficult to do. So anyway, yeah, so that's part of what I've started working on more now is supporting doing the kind of decolonial bioethics within the summer genome training program and supporting the kind of careers of some of these young scientists. But I mean, they would agree. But I think the feeling is they'd rather go slow and not only train our own scientists, but have people maybe like me and others who have enough understanding of scientific institutions to broker those relationships, but we also have understanding of tribal communities, because a lot of what we've had to deal with is getting science advising or gestures of collaboration from people who don't know anything about our communities and cultures, and they kind of come in like a bull in a china shop, right, and they don't know what they're doing. So.
I don't remember where in Canada, but at the last American Society of Human Genetics meeting, there were an entire panel about, an entire session about that. And there was a woman from Canada who discussed working.
Laura Arbor?
Probably
Yeah.
I'm so bad with names. But she had an entire video, like a 1 hour video of discussing, and actually seems like it is something that people are coming around and understand. The medical reasons to do that, not identity at all, not related to identity in any way.
But they're linked, I think.
It's the same tools used by in different ways. So yes, it is linked, but it's kind of disregarding an entire field of medicine, of not using the DNA.
Yeah, but people have to be working with people they trust, right? So yeah. We're working on it. They're working on it.
Thanks for your talk. It's great. I'm hoping that you could say a bit more about how claiming indigeneity is tied up in this particular form of nationalism, of U.S. nationalism. And I don't know if you can just kind of record U.S. imperialism evident in that. And I was also curious if you have any theories of where this desire of Canadians to claim identity or other agencies, where that might come from in Canada.
I've only been up there 3.5 years. Let's see. So the first, well, I feel like my whole talk was on why claiming Native American identity as part of the nationalist project. Did you want? I don't know that I can recap that quickly.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of connecting it to like the kind of cultural imperialism almost too in the United States. I'm Canadian, so
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Are you trying to figure out what the differences and similarities
Yeah.
are? So am I. Roger Simpson might have something to say on this. So am I, yeah. I mean, I notice a lot of similarities. Like, so I'm on this, there's this kind of private Facebook list on, they call them the FATI, the fake Métis, but they're FATI in the East. And I just kind of lurk. I mean, they let me on, but I don't say much because it's not my area. And it's fascinating to me how similar the dynamics are to this kind of Cherokee stuff happening in the South, right? The same kinds of claims, the same kinds of improbable stories, the same kinds of justifications, the same kind of excuses of defensiveness. So, but one of the things that it seems to me, but again, I live in Alberta, right? So the prairie provinces, and the reason I went there is because I'm from South Dakota. So I'm from a place where it's a red-white race line. And that's what I'm comfortable with. Like, for better and for worse, we're not invisibilized, but the forms of racism are explicitly violent anti-Indigenous forms. That's what you get, right? Whenever a people is like the minority in a place, they're gonna get the most violent kinds of racist stuff, right? And less of the erasing, more of the explicit kinds of. But that's what I grew up with, and it's what I'm more comfortable with. Like, at least we're seeing. And that's why I went to I would only live now in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or back in Minnesota. There's nowhere else I want to live. I've got to be on the northern prairies because that's what makes me feel, I just don't feel right if I'm not there much of the time. But there's that, so for me, there's not as much difference. I think it depends on where you are. So for me, the bigger differences that I notice are between wherever there's a significant proportion of Indigenous people versus maybe the coastal areas where we're less populous and then the kind of erasing forms of racism take over. And so I would say yes, in general, from what I can tell, Indigenous issues are more part of the national conversation in Canada, and explicit anti-Indigenous racism is more visible, but that is also mitigated by prairie versus coasts, I think. So I'm still trying to get a handle on, I mean, I definitely feel like the erasure across a broader swath of the US is more significant. You know, and I've lived and worked in every region of this country. I've traveled around a lot, and I cannot take the erasure anymore of the East and West Coast. Now, look at me, I'm super middle class, right? So when I go even back to a reservation border town, I might get followed around like I'm a thief, but I'm not gonna get racially profiled and subjected to the same kind of violence that I would have when I was a child or a young woman and I was poor. So it's easy for me to say I want to go back to the prairies because I do have class privilege to mitigate some of that explicit violence. But that's sort of my take on, I could make like comparisons and say, yes, you know, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, sure, and there is more visibility, but with it comes that more explicit violence. Do you want to add anything, Audra? But it's an interesting question, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And I hope, like in 15 years, that I try to delicately deal with this, because I'm so happy to be up there, because I'm happy to be on the prairies. But you know, I also will get grief from Indigenous people up there if I act like Canada's so great. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I just have like I don't know, I guess it's a question, but like I know you just mentioned that you're more concerned with the human population genetics, but there's also like it's a huge umbrella.
It's just who I'm, with the work on Native
exactly.
American stuff, that's all I work with,
So in terms of like Indigenous research agendas, like how have you been able to kind of like examine those while also like adhering to like cultural doctrines and practices, because it's a really fine line, but.
You mean Native people's genome research agendas? Or
Yeah,
just...
I guess so. I think when like an outside entity or in terms of like genome, they want to come into a population and extract any biological data that they want to in terms of getting research on prevalent diseases in that community. Like how like research agendas should become more indigenized, or the indigenous community indigenizing their research agenda in terms of respecting their cultural identities and also their biological identities.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there are sets of criteria that, you know, people have suggested, you know, could kind of be a model for how to work a little bit differently. So there's one Indigenous and non-Indigenous author who wrote the Canada Institute for Health Research Guidelines, you know, and so there was Indigenous community input into that. But I think more of what I've seen, you know, and those are helpful, I think more of what I've seen is individual communities on a case-by-case basis forging relationships with genome researchers, and also simultaneously focusing on building that research capacity within their own communities. So they'll often start with a research contract. They will, but it's hard, right? Like it's hard to forge a research contract that's protecting your interests and asking the kinds of questions you want to ask it when you're not familiar with the language and the science. It's really, Indigenous communities are a bit at a disadvantage without our own scientists and science policy advisors. So, but it's generally starting with those kinds of contracts. And then I'm sort of paying more attention to young Indigenous, like we're not moving around enough anymore. Young Indigenous scientists starting up their labs and doing their own work, and that's really interesting to watch. So in our summer internship, we started in 2011, and we had some participants who were PhD students. They've now graduated and they're starting their own labs, and they're taking over the leadership of that summer training program. And a couple of them, one is retrained as a bioethicist, the other one is still a geneticist, two young Navajo women, and they are at Navajo now trying to get them to repeal their genetic research moratorium, or at least talk about it. They're talking about doing some translation work between English and Navajo in genetic terms. This is going to be a life's work for both of them, right? And there's a lot of Navajo geneticists. Like they really focus on STEM education in that tribe. So to me, those are the interesting cases. But we're so early on in cultivating that kind of capacity that we are still mostly relying on the goodwill and interest of non-Native researchers who want to work collaboratively. Anyway, I don't have like a list of criteria for you, but they're out there.
I just asked because I'm familiar with I think it's called IPCB, the Indigenous Peoples Council about
yeah.
colonialism. That's a huge rise. It's really interesting, and I'm really like glad that's like really moving up in terms of like awareness, because like and like from Indigenous communities, I guess we've always battled like racism and extraction, but now it's kind of becoming legal. So like the Graves Repatriation Act, we're still fighting that, and in terms of racism, and now this huge fight with colonialism. It's really interesting how it all kind of intersects, because it's like they want to be recognized as Indigenous, but yet they're still taking like material items away that really mean a lot. Yeah, it's just interesting how kind of all intersects. But thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I don't know whose hands were in the I don't know where to go. Okay.
Hi, Kim. I'm so glad I could be here, and I hope I'm not the only Cherokee voice today, but, like, you know, one of the things that I find really vexing about the Andrea Smith and about the Elizabeth Warren business is that it revolves so much around memory and who gets to tell what stories. And I really liked how you framed the issue of entanglement and lived relations and becoming, and I've read a lot of your work on that before. But I wonder if you could speak today about this sort of like who has the right to memory and who has the right to telling what stories, because in a way, I believe Elizabeth Warren when she says that this is what they told me.
Oh yeah, totally.
And yet, I don't believe her when she says she's Cherokee. And so how do we reconcile the possibility of telling a story and having that story being recognized by the community without appealing to these positivist, eugenic, science discourses?
I mean, I know this like word memory is circulating in academia now, and I kind of don't know what people mean by that, other than my literal interpretation of what I know memory means. But so are you asking how I don't think she's lying.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's a nationalist myth, you know,
Yeah.
but I don't think I believe that she believes this, right?
Yeah.
What's really interesting to me is how, when presented with all of this evidence and with pretty nuanced and consistent pushback from Cherokee and other Indigenous analysts, that you still can't take any of that in. I mean, but then I don't know what it would be like to be somebody who believes this myth so deeply.
I mean, in
I
a
don't
way,
know what to do with
yeah,
that.
like it's like self-shattering in a way, and
Yeah.
I think that when that happens, you're confronted with something that is so deeply frightening.
Yeah.
That it's easier to just keep going with the same story
Yeah.
rather than actually confront the possibility that you are not who you thought you were.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, no matter what, like, she's not going to listen. She's not going to.
I've never seen somebody
No.
that's, I've never seen somebody come back from these kinds of claims.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be really interested to know if there's somebody out there who has,
Yeah.
and what kind of process they went through, and because literally I cannot empathize. Like, I'm not saying that in a bad way, like I refuse to empathize. I literally can't empathize. I can't get inside the head of somebody like that and imagine what that must feel like. And it seems like no amount of our offering precise analyses and arguments makes a difference. I mean, it makes a difference to people who aren't directly implicated in it, I think. But yeah, anyway, this is an interesting conversation. Who's the hand that is next? Yes.
I don't know if that's right. Is it for me?
Yes.
Okay, so Chafoya Regan, Chatasia Hoke, Ama Atali, Lene Hoking. Hi, my name's Regan. I'm Choctaw, and we are currently on unceded territory of the Lene Lenape. I wanted to thank you so much. You're like your biggest fan, so this is a big moment for me. But what I wanted to ask you was, there's been a huge resurgence of indigeneity and reclaiming indigeneity within Latinx communities, and a lot of that is based in genome science. And so I'm wondering, like, what your thought or like what your take is. I know it's not necessarily your purview,
Yeah.
but I'd love to hear you transpose your thoughts onto that.
I think, I'd have to understand how indigeneity is defined in the areas of the world they're coming from. It's defined differently in different places, and I'm not a believer in a universalist definition of who is indigenous. what this means then is it's hard to work globally with other Indigenous people sometimes. You know, I am very, and our summer Indigenous Genome Internship has gotten requests from Indigenous people all over the world to do this, and I'm like, but you haven't worked in South Africa, you haven't worked in Peru, you haven't worked here. Don't be flying into these places and setting up a summer Indigenous genome training program when you don't even know the politics of indigeneity on the ground. You could be allying yourself with an Elizabeth Warren for all you know. Like, you don't know, right? So I think we have to be pretty careful about, I stick to the landscapes that I know and the definitions of indigeneity that we forge in collectivity, and that makes sense to us. One of the, I do work with Sami people a bit, and they are much more embracing of DNA testing to reconnect than we are. And I just keep my mouth shut. I don't speak the languages over there, but I'm interested and I'm paying attention. I think one of the important differences is that, and this is shocking to me, but when we have people who say, well, we lost our identity and we were hiding in plain sight, it's not just their mom. Like, it's shocking to me how many people I've met over there, it was their mother who grew up Sami, and I'm like, how do you hide that? It's not multiple generations, it's a mother or grandmother or grandfather or whatever. It's very close, and they grow up in Sami territory and don't know they're Sami. This is, what? Like, I can't even believe this. So it's a bit different than our situation here. And in that case, where you still got living community all over the place and people that are relatively close biological relatives that you could reconnect with, kind of like adoptees, then I'm like, well, maybe it makes sense that you're using DNA. You know, so I think, yeah, you got to know the science and you've got to know the local or regional Indigenous politics to judge whether it's appropriate or not.
Excellent. Yeah, okay, thank you.
So let's have one more question in this forum, and then we can have more conversation. There's like a tiny little amount of refreshments. We didn't know we would get such a wonderful turnout, but hopefully we can have more dialogue during that. But maybe one more? Sure. Maybe.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex. Thank you for speaking today. So in your talk, you sort of touched upon this psycholinguistic shift from, talked about blood, talked about DNA as forming sort of the basis of like Indigenous sort of genealogy for these appropriators. So like with that in mind, my question is, how does that sort of shift from blood talks about blood to talks about DNA sort of reflect itself or affect the process in which Indigenous peoples themselves frame their own identity?
So I think what I've noticed is an earlier turn to gene talk and gene metaphors from blood talk in the non-native population of the United States. So I see this shift majorly happening in the mid-1990s, whereas Indigenous people, because we've got blood worked into our rules, right? And these blood quantum fractions, that's still the way the documentation talks about it, have been much slower to shift from blood talk to gene talk. That said, we do use the DNA parentage test, but we use that when we need it to be integrated into blood quantum rules. So it's still under an umbrella of blood quantum rules. So one of the things I always caution people to remember is that when genes and blood should not be, we should not be talking about those as if they're the same thing, because the blood that we're talking about in tribal citizenship criteria are, it's symbolic, there's no physiological examination of anything happening, it points to named ancestors on a tribal register. And there are names you can attach to those fractions, right? That can be quite different than the kind of genetic ancestry testing that these DNA testing companies are selling, which are not pointing to named affiliated relatives, but they're pointing to founding populations. So they're pointing to really different, they're all biological relations, but they're really different kinds of biological relations. So there are instances when we can say blood and genes and use them, kind of transpose them, but there's a lot of instances in which we should not. They're very specific kinds of technologies. I don't know if that's answering your question or not. But yeah, there's a whole conversation you could have about that, right? Because people do use those terms interchangeably in times when they shouldn't, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much.